écouter, faire de la musique, écouter, c'est plutôt des pratiques.
This session and start to thank the two invited speakers. So Emmanuel Bigand, which is connected from Dijon. Emmanuel is a professor of cognitive psychology at University of Burgundy. You will find the full presentation of his career and his important works on the Book of Abstracts. So I will really don't lose time by presenting, but just let me say that Emmanuel works on music and emotion since many, many years now. He published various books on the topic, individual and collective books. And the last one is La Symphonie Neuronale in 2020. And why did we invite Emmanuel Bigand? Because besides being a cognitive psychologist, he's very, very open toward the ethnomusicology and very interested in connecting with us ethnomusicologists and trying to broaden the frontier of his research. So Emmanuel also likes to visit, to go on the field, to go with ethnomusicologists on some field, and he came with me in Romania in 2007, I think, in the Roma village where I did my first fieldwork. So I think it is a really rare for a cognitive psychologist, which usually it's a kind of laboratory animal, as you know, to go out from the lab and to come with us on the field and try to understand what we do and how we work. So of course it's very, very different. And so this is because of his very open mind toward ethnomusicologists that we invite him. He also worked on health and specifically with Alzheimer's patients in hospitals and in public health institutions. So he's really the right person to deepen these three aspects of the symposium and of the project that I mentioned in the introduction. So bringing together emotion and health research, interdisciplinary framework, bringing together ethnomusicology and cognitive psychology, and third, trying to develop a cross-cultural framework and trying to come up with some more general hypotheses of ideas about emotion and healing related to music and dance. So thank you, Emmanuel. And the second speaker is Benjamin Koen. You met him this morning already. So once more, thank you very much for accepting this keynote invitation. Benjamin is really the person that we wanted with us for this symposium, because he really launched somehow and started to bring into attention this topic of music and healing in the anthropological and ethnomusicological community. He also organized a similar maybe symposium in 2004 in Florida, if I'm right. So he's very he works on this topic since quite a lot of years. He published important books on the topic, collective one, the Oxford Handbook of Medical Ethnomusicology, and also his monography in Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan specifically, also published by Oxford University Press. And so also Benjamin is very open-minded toward the interdisciplinarity, because besides traditional field research, he likes to try to do some experiments on the field, included some physiological measures of the changes in the body of people performing and listening to music and prayer. So thank you, both of you. I think we will organize this session by leaving half an hour time to each of you. I see that Emmanuel is ready with his slide. So if you don't mind, Benjamin, Emmanuel can start, and then you take the second part, and then we will have half an hour of discussion. So please go ahead, Emmanuel.
Okay, thank you, Filippo. And once again, I'm very happy to be with you to speak about music and emotion. And I confirm what you said, Filippo, that I think psychologists should work with ethnomusicologists and turn around the world to see the real reality of musical behavior in not only in our culture, but also in other type of cultures. So what I want to do today is to present some topics that have been addressed by psychologists about emotion. And I will just start with an overview of all the questions. First, the first thing is, do we perceive really emotion in music, or do we recognize emotion in music? Then we have the topic of what type of emotion do we experiment, and how should we investigate this emotion, what type of method. And then, of course, there is a question of universality of musical emotion. And I will open a little bit the term universality to address age, musical idioms, musical expertise, and of course, cultures. Then there is a problem of the psychological processes and the musical parameters inducing emotion, and a strange issue about the time course of musical emotion. And then, of course, for us, this problem of the brain network engaged in musical emotion. But before addressing this question, there is another one. Why studying musical emotion is so important for psychology? And I will just say something about that. And the main problem for us is to understand, maybe the same for you, why human beings are the only one living species who perform music. And for now, I don't think we know any human group without any kind of musical activity. And this suggests that musical behavior may have had an interest for adaptation. And this is why an ability in the brain for music has been evolved during phylogenesis. And if yes, we need to know how this occurred and what type of advantage music give to human species. And you know, there was this idea that music is just here for fun, and this was nicely developed by Stefan Pinker in a interesting provocative book, How the Mind Works. And in response, we have the community have proposed that the emotional power of music maybe is of adaptive value for human species. And the idea was initially developed by Darwin, as you know, and saying that music may have had an important role for finding a partner. And then this has been developed further by developmental psychology, for instance, Sandra Treuer, Laurie Trainor, and several other researchers, saying that the human baby is very special, is very immature, and the emotion regulation of this baby is crucial for his survival and his good development. And maybe the aptitude for music may have been selected during adaptation in order to ensure a good caring of the human baby, and then this has an adaptive value. So this idea was further developed by Sandra Taub in a study maybe that you know. And Sandra Taub says that all the baby around the world have the same problem. And if music has good advantage to take care of the babies, so we should find in every culture of the world music specifically designed for baby lullaby or nursery rhythms. And moreover, this since babies are exactly the same at the beginning of the life in all cultures, this music for babies should have common features. So there exist musical universals in that type of music. And she performed some studies and showing that there was some musical universals in lullabies and nursery rhyme. So maybe you could have some further information about that topic. And but what appears is that maybe music is some kind of auditory body language, which express some psychological state of the people. And because we need to know the psychological state of the other in order to live with them. Music may have had an important adaptive value, exactly as the emotional phases have an adaptive value and are in some way universal. So that's one point, and why we are interested with the emotional power of music, that maybe this emotional power played a very important role during phylogenesis and ontogenesis. And this is why we have neurons to process music, and why music is so important from a cognitive point of view. So I think that all the questions I would like to provide an overview here deal more or less directly with the biological value of music. And of course, this will not say that music has only biological value, but we can say that if music is very important from a cultural point of view, this is also because its biological value is very, very important. So what I propose to do is to travel a little bit around these six issues and then come back for discuss about what we can learn from the musical emotion. The first issue may be a little bit strange, but there are people saying that we do not experience emotion when we listen to music. We are a little bit like Snoopy. We can recognize that music has some emotion, but without experiencing emotion. So we can recognize emotion in music, but without experiencing emotion in our psychological taste. And maybe this is not completely wrong if you listen to that. I hope the sound is fine. Oops. It's enough to understand that you recognize the expression of sadness, but of course you are not sad because you are just listening to that. And this maybe sometimes is expressed as a difference with other emotion. When you look at someone who is sad, as this little girl, it's very difficult to not experience sadness because you have mirror neurons, and these mirror neurons create in your own psychological state the feeling of the other. And this is very important because this is the basis of empathy, and empathy is very necessary to live with other people. And we wonder whether music may have the same effect. And there is a paradox which seems to say, no, music is different, is that we love to listen to very sad music. And this is paradoxal. Why should we find sad music so beautiful? And some people said, but this is simply because we recognize sadness in music, but we don't experience sadness. I believe this is not completely true because mirror neurons that create the ability to reproduce movement in a quite automatic way, as you can see here with baby. If you do that to a baby, he will do that. So this is mirror neurons which are active there. Mirror neurons are also active in music. Music is the external expression of energy, psychological energy created by the composer or by the performer. And because we have mirror neuron, we internalize this energy inside us. And there are people who completely internalize that immediately. When you let children listen to music, they experience emotion very strong. And sometimes they say, stop this music, this makes me too sad. Or sometimes you say, oh, they say, this music makes me very happy. And there are also elderly people who are very sensitive to that. And so this provides evidence that in some situation, the emotion induced by music are really experienced in a strong way by listeners. And in fact, this is mostly a matter of time. Of course, in 2 or 3 seconds, maybe you are not supposed to experience strongly an emotion with music. But if you listen music for a longer time, you will start to be engaged in an emotional response. And there are numerous phenomena showing that, and you can see that even in Occidental listeners, we may have some kind of behavior very similar to trance, as described by Rouget, and music is able to do that. So it means that music can induce emotion, and maybe this is one of its interesting adaptive value, because it can put a large group of people in the same mood, which may be of good positive interest. Sometimes this may be badly used, but in any case, this provides that music emotion may have a very strong impact on human behavior. So it's not simply an intellectual question. Then the second issue is to say, okay, what are the emotions induced by music? And we know that for faces, for instance, there are between 4 and 8 specific basic emotions that seems to be universal, that we find in every type of culture, and that do not depend on age. We can find this emotion in babies. And the idea of psychologists was to say, okay, is this the same with music? And the group of Isabelle Peretz and others focus on 4 emotions that may be basic with music, which is happiness, sadness, scaredness, or serenity. Sometimes we can say scared or fear. We can change the term, but it's the same. And Isabelle Peretz and his group and her group made some experiments showing that effectively we can group musical excerpts according to these 4 main categories of emotion. And the type of experiment which is done to evaluate that consists, for instance, in listening to musical experts like that, and you don't know what is the emotional content of this expert, but you have to evaluate on a rating scales of happiness, serenity, sadness, or fearness, and how strong is each emotion experience for your own subjectivity in that excerpt. For instance, if you are listening to that, oops. And so in that excerpt, you will experience a large amount of happiness, probably not so much amount of other emotion. And you can see that you can do that for every type of music, and we can have an idea about the psychological profile of emotion experienced by listeners. And what we find most of the time is that happiness is very clear, fearness is very clear, the ambiguity is between sadness and serenity. Most of the people have trouble to differentiate perfectly, but they manage to differentiate, but there is a little bit more ambiguity. And of course, there are studies following another approach. And for instance, in that study, the author tests a large amount of listeners from 2 very different cultures, Chinese and American, and they have to report all the feelings they have with a large set of musical excerpts. And they found that we may have 13 emotion dimension of emotion with music. But if you look at this emotion, this feeling, you can see that there is redundancy between these feelings. Some are very close, and we don't know how far they are independent or not. Another way to address the content of musical emotion is completely different. This is one approach which rests on the idea that what we experience with music is of dimensional nature, but not of categorical nature. And we have made an experiment, I will explain a little bit here about that. And it consists in presenting musical excerpt like that. And the task of the subject was to group the excerpt that provide the same type of feeling, emotion, whatever. And so they group that, and then we analyze which excerpts were grouped or not grouped around all the participants we have tested, and we obtained a matrix of emotional similarities, which were value of 1, express that the except 4 and the except 3, for example, were always grouped by the subject, suggesting that they have a strong emotional similarity. By contrast, a value of 0 would say that no one, no people, no listeners have grouped these two excepts, suggesting that the two excepts are very dissimilar. And then when we run multidimensional scaling analysis of this matrix, we can project the except we have used in a 2 or 3 or more dimensional space, and then we can analyze the structure of this space. And if you listen for that except, for example, okay, you have an idea. If you look at that, you can see sorry, this is very different. And if you analyze all these except, you can define that, okay, one dimension is the energy that the music create in your own state. And the other dimension is nature of this energy, if it is positive like serenity or happiness, or if it is of negative emotional valence like angriness, for instance, here. A lot of energy, but a little bit more aggressive in some way. Of course, we find again the 4 main categories of emotion, but which is more interesting is that you can design some progressive travel through this emotional space by changing some pieces or changing some parameters of the pieces. And so you can modulate the emotional value of the experience by the listener in a more progressive way. For instance, if we were having time, we can slowly go from the very hard sadness, which is very dramatic, and softly change towards serenity, for instance, or sadness, a little melancholy. And this dimensional value of musical emotion, I think, correspond more of what we experience when listening to music. And also, this has a very important advantage for dealing with patients. We have psychological problems, for example, which are depressive. It's not possible with depressive person to let them listen to happy music and to make these people happy. You need to change progressively their psychological state, and you need to have a good representation of how continuous is the emotional space induced by music. So this is one another way to apprehend the content of the musical emotion. What we found also, which is very funny, is that you may have this same space with very short except. It means that the time course of emotion may be very short, as soon as 1 second you have an idea about the emotional content of the music. So the third point is about universality of emotion. Do we have something which are stable beyond difference of age, musical expertise of the listeners, musical style, and culture? And in some way, we can say yes. With age, we know that the baby, from the very beginning of the life, the first days of the life, according to the Perani studies, are able to differentiate the emotional content of the music. And what they did is to use musical pieces, Western musical pieces, but they change, they manipulate the structure to render this music sometimes dissonant and much more disagreeable and unpleasant. And what they found is that amygdala, this part of the brain which deal with negative emotion, responds to this music in newborn as soon as young as 1 to 3 days old. So it means that babies are immediately responsive to emotional content of music, and we know that because we know that music is usually used by mother and every type of people caring with dealing with the young babies, that you can change the emotional state of the baby by singing, and you can change the level of cortisol. And even if the baby is not born, you can change the state of the mother and the baby by playing music. So music is very has an immediate emotional power on the babies. And with the children, we find again that children, as soon as 5 years, manage to perceive some emotion induced by music, that happiness, sadness, angry, or fear, in the same way that adults, maybe a little bit less relevant, but always, but mostly in the same way as adults. So we do not need to wait long in order to respond in an emotional way to music. Then there is a question of musical expertise and musical style, and we can wonder whether the fact to be acknowledged in music may change the way we experience music. And of course, we can also wonder whether some style of music are not dealing with musical emotion which are completely diverse than other style. So I will just address these 2 points in a short way with a study we made with Philippe Lalit in Dijon with contemporary music. And for maybe some of you, contemporary music may induce a very specific emotion of angriness because you don't like contemporary music. But what we did, what we found is that it's not true. Contemporary music has a very strong power to evoke emotions that are very refined. So we did the same type of experiments that the one I have just explained 5 minutes ago. And we did that with a musician highly trained in contemporary music and student in psychology without any neither training nor familiarity with contemporary music. So very naive listeners. What we did, we used Stockhausen, Boulez, Xenakis, very strong, very hard, if I can say, contemporary music pieces, and we ask them the same to group the pieces that create the same type of feeling for them. And if all these pieces were creating angriness in listener, we will have only one group. But when we analyze the data, we found this is not true. We have once again a very beautiful space that differentiate pieces according to the dynamic, the arousals they create in listeners, and the type of emotions they induce, positive or negative one. And for instance, here, or maybe I could play that. Very active music, but positive emotion. And what we found is that there is no strong difference between highly trained listeners in contemporary music and naive listeners. And this is comparing the type of the 2 types of listener. We have the size of this arrow, and there are some differences, but not so much. So is music universal? Maybe you know this study by the group of Tom Fritz. He made this study in MAFA, with MAFA, and using the same type of experiment that Paul Ekman made, he played music for that were tested with experimental psychology and were found to be happy, to induce happy, sadness, or scaredness in listeners, Occidental listeners, and they compare the response of MAFA and Western listeners. And you see that there are some differences, but MAFA managed to differentiate the emotion induced by our music largely above chance and mostly in accordance with what a Western listener did. And we made another experiment with a student of mine who was from Morocco, and we used Moroccan music this time, and that we played to Moroccan listeners, musician and non-musician, or to French listeners, and they have to indicate whether the music they are listening were happy, sad, angry, and peaceful. And the music we have choose were selected by Moroccan musician expert to induce this emotion. This give you just to give you an idea about the sound. Oops, I managed to do that. So for Occidental listeners, this music is quite different from what we used to listen to. And here are the results of Moroccan listeners, musicians and non-musicians, and you see that they manage largely above chance to identify the emotion expressed by this music, with always this ambiguity between sadness and peaceful. And now the Occidental listeners, oops, here, and you see this is largely above chance and almost the same type of curve. There is no difference between expertise in Moroccan listeners. There is a little bit difference in expertise with Occidental listeners, but this time non-musicians are more similar to Moroccan response than musician one. The next issue is related to the mechanism that involve in emotion. And this paper by Ghislaine and Westphal was very famous because differentiate uh, they differentiate six. I don't know why this is a bad number, but six process that deal with that involve different brain structures and that should respond to music. I have no time to consider this process in more detail. But brainstem reflex is this type of structure linked to the quality of the sounds, the quality of the texture, the quality of the rhythm, and that may be tracked by the brainstem part, and that induce a different type of emotion. And this part may be strongly involved in the experiment we have done with contemporary music. Of course, we have conditioning like Pavlovian conditioning. We have emotional contagion linked to mirror neuron. We have visual imagery, the fact that music creates image in your brain. We have the episodic memory, and in ethnomusicology, you are very well accurate with this idea that music is a support for memory of the experience lived in a social group, and music is some kind of album that conserve the past of the experience. And of course, we have emotion linked to the structure of the music and notably musical expectancies. Maybe I will jump that. The idea of musical expectancy, I think you are all familiar with that. But when you listen to a musical context, your brain is creating expectancies. And of course, the musician, composer, performer, improviser can play with these expectancies. And depending whether or not these expectancies are resolved, the tension are relaxed, you experience different type of emotion. And maybe I could let you listen that if we were having time. But what is interesting is that in your brain, and this is studies that have been done by Salampur and Zator, you have part of the brain that follows this expectation. And when one part is expecting something to occur, we have an activation. And when these things occur, another part of the emotional brain is responding and produce dopamine. So this is very interesting to note and to observe that the musical structure is tracked in a very specific way by the emotional brain. A point I think I would like to return a little bit in a few minutes because I am a little bit late. Just to say that one word about the next issue, the time course of emotion with music. We know that when we are looking to important ecologically valid stimuli like a snake, we need a few milliseconds to be in alert. But what happened with music? We did an experiment. I used emotional gating paradigms. I presented a slice of musical excerpt, very short, such as 255 milliseconds, for example, and the subject were having to request to evaluate on a 10-point scale how moving this excerpt is for you, or how moving is the music where this excerpt was taken from. And we were using two types of excerpts that were judged by the subject after the experiment as weakly moved or strongly moving. And we tried to find the point, the duration that was sufficient to separate these two, except the point at which the listener start to have an idea about, oh, this except belong to weakly moving except, or this belong to strongly moving except. And we did that with pop and classical music. We did that with musically trained and untrained participants. And just to give you an idea, if you were running the experiment, you will have to evaluate whether this excerpt come for music you would have qualified as moving if you were having let listen for a longer time. Very hard. So it seemed completely absurd in some way. But when we look at the data, we found that 250 milliseconds is enough to start to separate strongly moving excerpt from weakly moving excerpt. Of course, the longer the excerpt, the easier is the task, but it is enough to separate the two. And it is true for low and high dynamic excerpt. This is true for pop and classical music. This is true for musician and non-musician. So this is a very robust phenomenon that very short time, a few set of milliseconds is enough to have an idea about the emotional value of the music. There are some differences, but I have no time to go inside. So it means that music is for our brain exactly as snakes or photo of a snake is for our brain. It immediately engages emotional systems. So what is the network for emotional response? It is here. This is all the reward systems we have here, and which is very, very important for human beings, but not only for human beings, for every species. And what has been found by Salampur and Zator at Montreal is that different part of the reward systems at caudate nucleus, putamen and accumbens nucleus were active when we listen to music we experience as pleasant. And the stronger the pleasure induced by music, the stronger the activation of this structure and the higher the production of dopamine by this reward system. And also, the higher is the price that the listeners claim to be able to give, to pay in order to have the musical accept that creates this sensation. And what was found is that the cortical fasciculus, the fasciculus fibers that relate the cortical area to the reward system, more they are active and more the pleasure experienced by the listeners is strong. And what Laura Ferreri has demonstrated recently is that if we block the connection between the cortical area and the reward system, we block the emotional experience with music. And last point, the larger the fasciculus of fiber between the reward system and the cortical area, the higher the probability to be engaged emotionally with music. And in contrast, in anhedonic persons, people who have no pleasure with music, this fasciculus is thinner. So I'm sorry, I think I'm almost on time. I think all these points which were addressed in detail by cognitive psychology provide some evidence that emotional response to music is a very robust phenomenon, which is not as subjective that we may have imagined or that music theorists usually think to be. And for us, all this result provides evidence of the biological value of music. And because this value is very high, of course, this has a lot of impact for healing issue and for all the use of music with patients, different type of patients, in order to use this emotional power to accompany or to regulate, to compensate for deficit in that patient, a point probably we will come back later. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry if I was a little bit longer as I expect to be.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. You can now maybe go out from your shared desktop.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you very much. Really, it was a very difficult exercise to summarize so many years of research on musical emotion. It's a very large field of research in cognitive psychology and neurosciences. So thanks for this talk. And sorry if the keynotes are so short, but the interest here is right away to go on the other side of the wall or the bridge and to listen to Benjamin Koen, which will give the second part of this keynote session. Are you there, Ben? Great.
Yes,
Thanks.
I'm here. Let me open up my session here and we'll get started. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
All right, so actually, one thing I want to do here is share a little bit about what I've been involved in over the years, some recent projects I've been working on that are basically exploring this power of music meditation for healing, health, and well-being. And let's see, I'd like to just kind of come to it and think out loud together and ask you to kind of question the models and methods and approaches, the mechanisms and the ideas that I'm proposing, and see how they relate to the work that you're involved in. Do you find them to be valuable in understanding the next level of the mechanism, as it were, the process of how music can either facilitate healing, support health and well-being, and I'm very interested in that. For me, it's been quite helpful to frame the understanding of how music can facilitate healing, but at the very outset, it begs many questions that I think challenge us all where we are right now to conceptualize music itself, healing itself, health and well-being, and how they relate. One of the things that I think underlies the whole process is understanding music as a vehicle of meaning, or music as a channel, a way of meaning. And that, as human beings, this might be one of the most important aspects of why we make music, the meaning that it conveys. Now, the specific content of that meaning and the way biologically, neurophysiologically, emotionally, and so forth, we embody that meaning, take it in as it has its impact, is quite challenging, right? I think one of the things that comes out in my own experience of diving into the research from many disciplines and coming to grips with how people are understanding music, how I have understood it coming up as a musician, and being involved from an early age with just making music for people that were going through all kinds of illness and healing processes, mostly because of my family situation. My father was a surgeon. My mother was a nurse, a director of nursing at a skilled nursing facility with over 200 patients. And my brother, who also ended up going into medicine, a neurosurgeon, we would mow the lawn and take care of the flowers and the things in this nursing home. And then afterwards, I would go in, hang out, become friends with, share space with, make music for and with many of the residents. And, I started to, in a very kind of unfantastic way, see not only the power of music to connect people, but also help us move from one state of being to another, a state of illness or dis-ease or any kind of condition, to one of health and well-being, right? And how that all works. That became quite a interesting question for me. But, you know, conducting experimental research becomes very challenging when we're dealing with something as complex, as rich and diverse as music. And one of the things in the literature that's quite interesting when you look at different areas of the literature that are interested in music's potential to facilitate healing or support health and well-being, is that the rigor involved often is in the experimental design is quite high, but the rigor involved in understanding and linking the components of music, whether it's the sonic aspects, you know, things like timbre and amplitude and frequency and waveform, or the cultural aspects and the meaning aspects, right? For example, in some of the research that was mentioned before, if I just mention the word Mado to a person who practices the Mado ceremony in Tajikistan, in the Palmyra Mountains, immediately creates a response in the person, an expectation, a kind of way of relating to the potential that that music carries, as where for someone else it wouldn't have that, right? So I want to kind of jump into it from that, you know, perspective and go through some of these things here together and see. You know many that this idea of medical ethnomusicology, and I'm not wedded to the name at all, although sure, you know, we several of us pioneered and developed this area, but it was a way to think about and participate in a kind of open circle, trying to create an open discourse with people in psychology, in medicine, traditional practitioners, people that are interested in this potentiality of music and related practices to help us in that realm of healing, health, and well-being. And I conceived of it really as a holistic field that was not only about, say, field research, but also performance and applied practice that, you know, for lack of a better word, would encompass all of these things: music, sound, dance, creative media, with that goal in mind. So I'll just go through a few of these books here. This I think was already mentioned. These are some of the things where this research has been explored. This is a more popular kind of thing. There's a couple popular books I worked on just to kind of extend that from the research domain into the general public and help to link that conversation. Here's one that's looking at this idea of music, the mind, and meditation. It was also published in Chinese. A couple textbooks featuring some of my compositions and research and ideas. I'll just kind of blow through these. It's not, so here's a couple recent edited volumes. Interesting, you know, just kind of how this is developing in the academic landscape. There's more and more interest. And I think it speaks to that, some of those early slides that Emmanuel shared with us. What is it about music and human beings that is so profound and deep within us that we move to it, we come to it in a very intuitive way. And the question arises, well, how do we take it deeper, right? And so I want to propose a new paradigm that has been, you know, an ongoing theme in my work. Part of this idea about music and meditation is that music, you know, there's a ton of research about music, healing, health, and well-being, plenty of research about meditation, health, and well-being, but really there's this area where they come together, where they're one and the same, right? And so that's what I'm thinking about now and focusing on. And so there's three aspects of this paradigm, something I call music meditation dynamics, 5 factors of music, health, and healing, and something that is about these culture-specific, culture-dependent, and culture-transcendent principles and processes, or universals rather, that try to explain the how, or the mechanism of what's really happening when music heals. And so the music meditation dynamics model has 4 parameters. One is music alone, meditation alone, music and meditation combined, and unified music meditation. So, you know, there's tons of research about these two levels, music, healing, health, and well-being, meditation as well. But there's also this center area where it's potentially the most efficacious in my experience. On a side note, there's a couple interesting things happening. I just finished a course here at the university here in Hong Kong Baptist University, a capstone course. It had about 30 students, and the course was music meditation for health, well-being, and goal achievement. And it had a music meditation system, a process that I developed that all the students learned, and they went through these 5 factors that we'll look at, this assessment process of basically deciding what's most important for them in each of these 5 dimensions or factors. And it's basically the bio, psycho, social, emotional, spiritual. And then in all of life, in this particular moment, what's the most important thing for them to achieve, to move toward, to, and so they then practice this music meditation process for 30 days, some for about 40 or so. But it was quite amazing that in all of the factors and in their specific goal, universally, they all had an experience of improvement, of well-being, of achieving their goals, moving in the direction of their goals if it was something more long-term. So we'll look a little bit at that. The other thing is that I'm involved in this research project with some colleagues from exercise physiology, health science, and some neuroscientists that were doing some metabolomic rate measures and of neurotransmitters, of some hormones, probably cortisol, and to look at this music meditation process from a deep physiological level. So I just kind of want to put that out there as something that maybe we can return to. So an interesting thing I think to mention that kind of is a challenge, I think, for us where we're now is really thinking about things, conceptualizing them as holistic, right? And so these 5 factors, the biopsychosocial, emotional, spiritual, or transcendent, if you will, in this model conceptually, it poses a challenge to maybe not so much the research designs that we develop, but in our understanding of them. And in this model, these 5 factors are really interchangeable. You know, often people think about, well, the psychological and emotional overlap quite a bit. And of course, you know, the movement in cognitive science and the research specifically on emotion has been quite important. But I think to interrogate what's really happening and to get us to the next level, we might have to reconceptualize the, you know, arena that we're playing in. When we think of the human being comprised of these 5 dimensions or aspects, you know, and you could change them, you could have, you know, fewer, less, or more, but you get the idea that we can't really talk about one without the other. You know, even if we think about the process, the neurophysiological process of a sound wave coming in, hitting the tympanum, going through the inner ear, you know, activating the basilar membrane, releasing neurotransmitters through the 8th cranial nerve, and the cascade of neurotransmitters that comes through our body, the biochemical response that is linked to what we call our emotional experience, that what is the difference between all of these domains, because they impact all of them. So truly thinking about something holistically is one of our challenges, I think, right now, because we have to reconceptualize the very nature of what we're talking about. And then our research designs have to also take that into consideration. It's much easier, I suppose, in the ethnographic way of exploring them. So let's just keep that in mind as we go. So these 5 factors, for example, the beauty of them or the power in them is that when we think about the human being having the biological, psychological, social, emotional, and spiritual domains, they're really part of one whole, right? And therefore, health and healing also have these 5 factors. And the interesting thing is that music, and I would say music meditation, also have these same 5 factors. Music has a physical aspect, and it affects us biologically, physically. It has a psychological aspect, right? It has an emotional aspect. It has a social aspect and a spiritual or transcendent aspect, right? And when we bring these 5 factors of music together with the 5 factors of the human being, health and healing, we start to see that there are really an incredible amount of interconnected potentialities to impact the healing process, health and well-being. So over here on the left is just a little start of, drawing some of these connections, that, for example, the sonic aspect or physical aspect of music can impact a person psychologically. And that psychological aspect of music can then impact a person's emotional well-being, which impacts their health, right? So these are kind of the things I'm thinking about. Now, there's 7 underlying principles or processes that I like to touch on. One is creativity, and by that I mean the ability to create. I don't mean being an artist or a musician, but the human capacity to create is one of the aspects of this underlying process. Music mind dynamics is about that dynamic relationship between music, the brain, music and the mind, and how the neurophysiology of music is really part and parcel of its impact. And when we look at that, it's hard to tease out what is, or I would say probably impossible to tease out distinct different categories in how music's impact plays out in the human being. Neuroplasticity, psychological flexibility, entrainment, and beingment, which is basically like holistic embodiment, that when the meaning that music conveys, we don't just embody it, say, in a biological or physical aspect, but really in the whole of our being, in the emotional aspect, in the neurocognitive aspect, in it plays out in our sociality and our relationships. And then something I call the human certainty principle that maybe we'll talk about more, maybe some of you have read about it, that one of the things that music seems to do is take us into a state where we have insights that we wouldn't otherwise have. And the link with meditation is that in a lot of this work, music itself is meditation. Whether or not we call it that, similar to what I think Livia was discussing in the beginning, sometimes people aren't coming to the dance thinking about, hey, I'm going for healing, but when you're asked, they certainly recognize that. So there's some kind of perhaps unconscious motivation or way of going there, a reason, propelling us to that. There's something I've developed called the C meditation. C is an acronym for see, experience, and act. And that is the framework for this music meditation practice that was taught in this course and that I use in a lot of applied work with people. So it starts with that deep dive 5-factor assessment on what's most important in each of those 5 domains, getting clear about what is that goal. So to see that end in the beginning, to experience that in the context of the music meditation, and then to arise from that distinctive practice of music meditation and act on that as though it's already been realized. There's so much to share about it, but I kind of have to go on here. This is the idea of that in the process of music meditation, and here the idea of the role of music is about conveying that meaning. So music has this unique ability that really connects to our brain in a much more holistic way than we previously thought. And there's a coupling process in the C meditation practice of basically teaching people to use 3 different kinds of music. One is one's own voice, one is familiar music, and another is unfamiliar music. Now, the challenge with familiar music is that it already conveys meaning. It already has meaning assigned, ascribed to it, right? But unfamiliar music, we can also perhaps more easily assign the meaning that we want, that particular meaning being that end goal that a person is working towards. So healing could be also conceptualized as a goal, right? And so basically, one moved from kind of a lower consciousness to a higher consciousness state. And this dotted line is kind of a just from lower to higher, but really meditation is more like this wavy line. It goes up and down, thoughts come in and come out. But at some point, as they go through this training, they have an experience that is representative of that state they want to be in. Okay, and I'll give an example of that. Then they come down from the meditative experience here at number 3, and they go throughout their day. Now, this dotted circle here is a kind of reflection to this high state of consciousness they experienced in the music meditation. And this is a way to extend that energy, that practice, that state of being into their day. As you do that morning and evening, you can start to see that the amount of consciousness, you could say, that you transform, you traverse, grows, right? And if you continue to do that over a long period of time, you see that they just progressively build. So at the end of each session, your new baseline is a little bit higher, and you continue to grow in that way. That's the idea. So there's this kind of upward expanding spiral of embeingment by focusing on that which is most important, in this case, health and healing, internalizing it and realizing it, creating it. This is kind of the overarching model that shows the 5 factors of the human being: healing, well-being, and music meditation, all sharing the same 5 factors. The cultural space wherein meaning lies. And here we're not thinking about group culture, but really that can be part of it, but really thinking about each individual more as their own cultural landscape. And these 7 principles and processes underpinning that experience. I'll just give a brief overview of some people that I've worked with, students or clients that have used this C meditation process to deal with their particular condition or problem. You can just see here what she was dealing with. She had been to see lots of different health professionals, physicians, psychotherapists, and so forth. These were the things that she was challenged in dealing with. It wasn't until she really, this was for years, she was 19, 20 through this process when we worked together. She used prayer, personal effort in her own, trying to resolve her problem. No results. Sorry, I'm trying to move this. Okay. So this is what happened at the other end. And this is after about a 3-month process. So she developed a healthy self-image. She totally transformed, the way she viewed herself, her identity. She was at risk of early onset diabetes. And then she, this was kind of a cool thing because several of the people were in contact with their physician. And, we can, see how they're progressing in a medical way through their condition into healing. One interesting thing in this last course that I taught, we had one student being treated for depression. And so his physician gave us some feedback about his process that, at the end of this study or practice that he did, he was no longer in a depressed state clinically. Let me just go through here. Let me let me jump into another person because I think this might be interesting. Samantha, she had a surgery and general anesthesia. She had to stay in the ICU for a long time. It was really a problem. She suffered a lot. We taught her the C meditation practice over a 7-day period so that she could participate in her surgery, in her, preparation for her surgery and post-op. And so basically what she did was, listen to music that was deeply meaningful to her, that was accompanied with meditations and prayers that were part of her personal practice. And she started to really reconceptualize everything that she thought about her potential power to participate in her healing, emotion of which was a huge part of it. And, she went through the process of her surgery and was home, and I think it was 2 days after, having a wonderful experience. I think these will be up. I'll just leave them up then, so later if we want to see them, we can. Okay, so I think if we jump into some discussion, we're going to have a lot more to share together. So why don't we do that?
Great. Thank you, Benjamin.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Emmanuel is still there?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so since we have, thank you for respecting the time schedule, both of you. So reductionistic point of view from one side, very experimental, and the other one side, holistic and very, let's say, general point of view and deep, profound thinking on emotions and healing music. So really, I would like to open directly the floor for questions and maybe keep my point of view to the end if there is time. So please go on. Write. You might write on the write down on the chat, or raise your hand if you wish. Yes, Bernd, I see you. Go on.
Well, thank you. I take the chance to speak. Well, thank you very much to both of you for this amazing presentations of kind of really two poles of this continuum of music, emotion, well-being, based on very different methods, especially of approaching what music is, what music does, and how do we gain knowledge about it. That's maybe the main point concerning myself here. And this is my question mainly to Benjamin. Well, we know each other and we've had a lot of discussions, but now my question is about your methods. It appears to me that you're presenting a method or a technique that you develop on your own account with your own experiences with clients and whatever, friends and clients and clinical settings and so on, in order to achieve an effective method of this music meditation well-being practice, healthy, wealthy, happy you, or happy, healthy, wealthy you. So I think this is a very practical approach, and it's, in my scholarly opinion, very much based on analogic thinking. Maybe this is also kind of connected with your Chinese experiences. Chinese is a very analogic society. So it appears to me very unacademic in the sense of strict Western modern scientific thinking, as was kind of exposed by Emmanuel Bigand. And yours is the opposite. It's a very analogic thinking. It's a very associative thinking, and it's based on practice. And that's Well, that was the comment. Maybe the question is, how do you deal with that? I mean, for me, this is not research. For me, this is a presentation of your own practice, which is totally legitimate. But I don't see the research point. If I take it as research, it becomes very provocative because it's very analogic and not based on any scholarly scrutiny. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a good continuation of our last discussion, I suppose. You know, I'm quite excited about the research project that I'm involved in now because it brings these two things together. You know, and we're doing some very rigorous metabolic neurophysiologic measures, and so you know. The experimental research that I did before, looking at stress modulation and you know, measuring simple things like heart rate, blood pressure, that was, you know, statistically significant. Probably you read some of that stuff. You know, it's all good. I guess, you know, for me, one of the shifts in academia, in education itself, is something that I'm very interested in. And I think it has to do with, you know, coming to the whole topic as a musician and as someone who used my own experience for my own health and well-being, my own healing experience, and starting to share. So, you know, that story is something that is part and parcel of my life. And so, you know, the rigorous aspect is a little bit hard to present in this time frame, but yeah, I would disagree. I would just say that, you know, just like the whole idea of how are we going to conceptualize our psychology, right? Our body, our biology. How do we conceptualize that? And I know you're very interested in and thoughtful about how different cultures conceive of such things, even music itself, right? And so, you know, kind of this part of my work is to be provocative and is to say, you know, to bring these kind of questions out, because a lot of the literature, you go on PubMed or any other, you know, look at the literature across disciplines. What you know about the music when you see it is almost nil, you know, in a lot of it. And when it's, I suppose, explored in any detail, we really don't know what aspect of the music is the effective component. You know, if we're talking about healing and well-being, for example, if we're talking about, you know, depressive markers that have, you know, increased over COVID, and, you know, it's kind of like, in order to understand the potential that music is playing to help people out of that state, it's very, it's not only individual to the person, but it changes over time. You know, what you need today might be different from what you need tomorrow. And so trying to come up with, hey, this is the aspect of music that really shifts this potential in a person. And I suppose part of it is, you know, after my 20 years of being in academia or more, I really, I'm not so concerned about that aspect. I'm really concerned most about, has this helped someone? And what do I derive on the back end of understanding it, right? And so there's these frameworks and models that have, I mean, I respect what you're saying. It seems to be my own understanding about how it's working, right? Which is, you know, I admit that. But it seems to work when I apply it with everyone that I've worked with. So, you know, now what I'm very interested in is, hey, how can we actually look at, you know, if neuroplasticity is at issue? Psychological flexibility, absolutely, very easy to test, and kind of that comes out in the ethnographic data and so forth. But something like neuroplasticity, neurotransmitters that are, you know, related to different emotional states, that research, I think, is where, you know, where we need to go. So, How does that feel? Is that how do you feel about that answer, Bernd?
Yes, he said, yeah, Bernd is happy about your answer, and I know it's a discussion that you started maybe in ICTM last year, where you also had a panel on this topic. So let's go on with some questions. So there are a few. There is another Benjamin that wants to ask a question to Emmanuel, and I give the priority to this question because Emmanuel has to leave, and I will also add one for Emmanuel Bigand. And so my question is, if all you told us, Emmanuel, would be the same if we change the word music with some other stimulus like visual arts or sculpture or food? How would that change? I mean, what is the specific really of music in this emotional impact and this importance for human being? It's only music, or it's all also sculpture, visual art, or paintings that. So what about if we change, if we did another presentation of your talk and change the word music with another of the, let's say, art? So what is specific to music in this emotional and healing power? And the same comment is also valid for Benjamin. But let me give let's see if there is another question for Emmanuel before he replies. Benjamin Lapidus, are you there?
Hi, thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Go on. Yes, please.
Yeah, no, thank you both. I enjoyed your presentations. Emmanuel, I was struck by the experiment with the short listening, and I was wondering if you were familiar with Giovanni Giuriati's work on quantum music, particularly in 1999. He had written a bit about this, and apparently, I believe in Italy, in Rome, there was a competition where they would play, music, 250 milliseconds, and people would have to identify. The competition was to identify the pieces in that time period. So, I think kind of the things that Giuriati was looking at that time were, the implications of these very small, at least one of the pieces of the implications were these very small pieces of sound and how they already, triggered, meanings and, all the implications surrounding, how the music was made, who was making the music and so forth. So I was just curious, how if that particular, body of knowledge or what Giuriati was trying to get at compared to what you presented, if you have any comment on that.
I don't know. I didn't know this experiment made in Rome, but I would like to have the link if you can send me or to Filippo the link. I was knowing a composer, an Italian composer, who made this type of things and cutting some pieces of Beethoven in short slice and reorganizing the whole. But I didn't know this experiment. But in some ways, this is good suggestion to respond also to Filippo about the specificity of music. And I don't know how we can compare music with all the visual art, for instance. But one thing that music has, but not the other art, is the fact that music starts to be effective on the brain of babies much before all the other art. For instance, before the birth, music is already active. And music uses the auditory canal, which is very responding to sounds. And in some ways, this is this type of specificity which could give the strong advantage for adaptation for all musical activities. So I don't want to say that music is the best compared to other art, because I don't think this is the issue, but there are some specificity with music which are partly due to the fact that the interaction with music start before birth and with the fetus, and also because music is extremely active to stimulate the brain. And this is the last question. Even a short slice of music can activate emotional brain, and I'm not sure that we could have the same with visual art. This is an open question for that. But there are some specificity, sure. And I'm sorry, but I apologize. I must leave now the group, but thank you very much for your invitation, Filippo, and I wish you a good debate now. Sorry if I have to leave.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. Maybe if some other people have a question for you, we will send you the question by email, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course.
You might reply later on. Bye-bye. Thank you. So, okay.
Oh,
Okay.
too bad. I wanted to ask Emmanuel a question about, controlling for things like meaning in the music, and also this whole thing with the millisecond. I remember working with David Huron at Ohio State, and one of the things that we studied in this kind of millisecond time range and identifying thing was, and Benjamin, maybe you have some knowledge of this, is that timbre was the factor that people immediately identify. And that, so, thinking about, hey, I'm going to play 5 different pieces of, so-called classical music and get some idea about what it means, this, that, the other. Really, that's not the thing. It's really about the timbre that people immediately identify. And then thinking further into, okay, that's all good and well, but when we're talking about healing, transformation, the power of the emotional impact of music and dance, that, what we're usually interested in is a much deeper engagement with that experience, music and dance, whatever it might be, right? So anyway.
Yes,
that's what
you have. There are a couple of questions for you, Benjamin, coming from Susanna Source. Are you there?
Yes, hello.
Yes, please go on with your question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what kind of music did you use in the meditation? Like, was it, who selected it?
So, through the training process, we experience a bunch of different kinds of music, and there are people that are musicians, some that are not, some that are, and so it's all self-selected. There's some of the research I did that is in that book, Beyond the Roof of the World, where we used 4 different groups. There was the local devotional music called Mado. There was some unfamiliar devotional music that I played on some local instrument kind of within the region, like a Persian ney, even though it wasn't a Tajik ney, a Chinese bamboo flute, another kind of related instrument, a Lakota-styled Plains Indian flute, and some prayers and meditations that were part. So something unfamiliar, but kind of related. Then there was some local pop music, and then there was nothing, silence. And so these 4 control groups are the things we tested around these parameters of, music alone, meditation, prayer alone, combined and unified. But in this, bit that I was talking about during the presentation, it was all self-selected. And over this kind of 30-day period, they also changed the music that they used, depending on what their particular interest was. Some of them used the same thing throughout the whole process, And so, I'm very interested in how we assign meaning to music and what that coupling process is neurologically and meaning-wise. I guess ultimately it's about meaning. And, to Bern's point, I'm really in between I realize the value in that and putting the science behind it. And that's what this project we're working on now is all about. It's quite in-depth and rigorous. It's going to be super cool. But I also, like most of us, know that the experiential part is that it works, it is there, it is happening. So, conceptualizing it in this way that can bring more people into the mix, moving from that, universal kind of human intuition that we turn to music for this particular outcome, to change our state, in other words, right? Whether it's in a sporting event, a romantic setting, a personal thing, whatever it might be. moving from that intuitive turning to music as human beings into a deeper engagement with it that facilitates that transformation, that we're looking for.
Okay.
Make sense, Susanna?
Thank you, both of you. There is another question for you coming from Livia that you met this morning.
Oh yeah, Livia. Hermana de España.
Yes, well, thank you both for these fascinating presentations. And yeah, my question is somehow connected to Susanna's question. I see that the music meditation is a key concept in your presentation. And I was wondering, what does it consist on in practice? So this technique of music meditation that you were talking about, are we talking about, for example, practicing mindfulness with music? Are we talking about playing music, entering the flow mode? Are we talking about deep listening of music, close to trance experiences? Are we talking also about dancing deeply connected with the music? Could you please elaborate more on this to understand it better? Thank you.
I love that. And the answers are yes, 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 and yes. And so, kind of the way I set it up is to allow people that flexibility of their own experience. So that particular way of approaching music meditation that I call the C meditation practice is something that is based on, it has two aspects. It has the mindfulness aspect. It has a deep relaxation, detachment, presence, beingness aspect of being, right? So we explore that in depth, right? But then it has this other aspect of directed that from that state of being, introducing the goal that is most important for the person. So in the healing space, if a person is in need of searching for healing, right, to get to a state of health and well-being, then from that state of mindfulness, presence, beingness, to then introduce that goal into that state of consciousness and experience it in their meditation. So it has that aspect for sure, but it has this other one, which is very goal-oriented, you could say, goal-oriented. Sometimes that, the language, it's kind of like a language game we're playing in a way. And I know that in academia and research, these are very important things, but I think we're challenged in a way to redefine them in a way that, ultimately serves people more. So I'm happy to throw away any concepts, ideas, terms for a better one. I do have a deep interest in the movement and dance aspect more, because few people kind of engage it in that way, but it is something that many people incorporate into their meditation practice, So, I haven't done a study that's like, look, we're going to use these people and you're only going to do it this way, and it's only about getting into a trance state. It's only about getting into a mindfulness state, or you're only going to use this music and this dance. There's a couple studies I'd like to do that deal with didgeridoo and long tones and kind of vocalization and kind of droning as the music source. That simplifies a lot of the things that are problematic about doing research on music because of its complexity. So there are some things I think to do, but yeah, it's a challenge. But all those things you mentioned are part of what people practice and experience.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions or curiosity about prices and cost of Benjamin Koen treatments, or any? Healing, it's a business as well, huh? Isn't it? Yes.
Also, and part of the thing, Filippo, is that there's a lot of, there's a lot of charlatans, or there's also well-meaning people that really don't have a clue. And they say, hey, listen to this, it will achieve that goal. And it's just, for lack of a better word, it's just total bullshit. It's just not based in any kind of rigorous experimentation or thoughtful philosophical consideration about, these points that I'm trying to raise,
Sure.
Because it's way more complex and diverse than that.
Right.
And yet that potential is there, and we seem to know that, you know what I mean? We seem to know quite clearly that music can take us to a different state of being, experience, and changes us on the other end. Right?
Yes, well, I have the same question that I made to Emmanuel. So why music and not something other? Why not food or visual? Or I mean, I remember when once we introduced our lab in Paris in CNRS, Laboratory of Ethnomusicology, and one anthropologist, precisely Michael Hautman, that was cited before, said, "So why are you studying music and not food?" I mean, what's the difference between why don't you do a laboratory of ethno food ecology? Why are you studying music? So this question is always pertinent. I think it's always present in my mind. So why are we? Of course, we talk about music because maybe we have a musical past or we are musical lover, etc. But and indeed, when we look analytically on healing practices, music is never alone, and in many cases, not even the most important aspect of the healing practice. So maybe some kind of reaction on this, I really appreciate it. But there is a Sophie also who has a question, and then Bernd also another comment. Okay, Sophie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I just wanted what Benjamin was speaking connect with the notion of flow that I was using during my conversation. And I don't know if you want to comment something about that, about the concentration, about the present moment, about the achievement of a challenge, of something that you are thinking about. It seems that it was really connected. And for the flow I could read, it seemed that it happened in everything, not only in music, on dance, it's in everything.
Yeah, I think it's a really important, frame of understanding that is often quite present. And I think it links to the two aspects of this practice I was sharing, is that there is that very focused concentration that leads to a state of experience, that we call flow and so forth. And then there's this other one that is not about that kind of concentration. It's about presence and beingness. And, can these two concepts overlap? And is there something in between? Is it important to define such, borders? Not really for me personally. But I think that is something that can be very profoundly transformative. And, a lot of the, for example, in the class that I just finished that did this practice, there were a couple of musicians that, because of the cognitive focus needed in performing, they would actually, use that concentration and then transcend it, get into that flow state. And that was important for their practice, but it wasn't universal. In other words, every morning and evening, that wasn't the thing they would do, but it was part of their overall, the overarching experience they had in the project. I think that whole thing becomes a challenge as well, because the diversity of our own experience of engaging with music is not uniform, even within our own selves, right? And it speaks to, I think, the question that Filippo was mentioning, is that I think the unique or distinctive nature of music is its I think what you're bringing up is another level of holistic consideration, right? So within that, the whole human experience, where touch and food and music and sociality and all of it is part of our well-being, right? So it's not that we can deny any of these aspects, right? Our connection with other humans, with nature, the food, the nutrition, our relationship to stress, not just stress, but our relationship, it's all part of the puzzle. But I think when we look at the specific aspect of music's potential and the preeminent role that the brain plays in our health and well-being, and the role that music, the way that music connects to that, is something that is why it's important, you know. And it's one of those things that, you know, the advances in neuroscience on one hand and in music research on the other are two things that have been incredibly important over the last 20 years, but we still know so little about them. And I think a lot of the claims that are made based on, you know, specific kind of rigorous research that looks at a specific thing in the discussion part don't really get us to the next level of understanding, you know. So that's kind of what I'm interested in mostly.
Right, thank you very much. There are some references being sent through in the chat. Any other? Ah, yes, Bernd, sorry, I saw you before. Yes, please go on.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much. I would like just a brief comment. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. On those two issues raised before, one about this very short excerpt that make you recognize timbre. I think this is actually quite easily answered with psychoacoustics, like the stimulus of harmonics is processed in the cochlea and the basilar membrane, where any form of melody or changing of tones or whatever takes time, of course, but timbre is present in a very small time frame. So psychoacoustically, it's obvious that this is the one thing that really jumps into your perception in one instance. So this is a quite easy explanation, I think. And the other thing I wanted to comment on is Filippo, your concern. Yeah, it's what Benjamin was now also talking about. Why music? What's the difference of music to other activities, whatever, food and so on? And I'd suggest that we should turn away a little bit from the term of music and include sounds in general and what I would call the auditory domain. Because the auditory domain has three properties that are distinct, for example, from the visual or from the taste sense or something. But they are shared with olfaction, funny enough. The olfaction is sharing these properties. The first one is that we can listen around the corner. So if I'm behind the wall or behind the corner, you can't see me, but you can hear me when I go on speaking. Yeah? So so hearing is not necessarily connected to vision, to visibility, or to immediate presence. So it suggests very much to connect the auditory with not present entities. Yeah?
Yes, but yes, the visual. If you think about mental imagery, the ability to reproduce images mentally, which is also used in so many rituals, using possibility to see things that are not visible, is actually working the same.
No, I think it's different, because you can also imagine auditory things in the same thing you can imagine vision. However, you can actually hear physically. You can physically hear things that occur around the corner.
Yeah.
So, you know, as another comment to this, it seems. What do you think about this? It's like, to link those kind of understandings, if we do some experimentation about it, to the power, the emotional power of music and dance for healing, there's a huge gap. But conceptually, to hear things, to see things that aren't there. For example, an ill person that stays in that state can't often see the state of healing, right? And so conceptually, there's a link there in terms of understanding how the vehicle of music could help to convey that meaning of that state that they actually want to get to, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So that's an interesting thing. I think that's kind of the thing where, you know.
Let me mention the two others.
The other two, yeah, the two others.
The other two, because the second one is that the sonic experience is always shared. Like if you eat food, I have to necessarily eat something different than you eat, not the same thing. Yeah. And if we see something, we also have different perspectives, and I can look this way and you look the other way, but we cannot listen to this or the other way so easily. We cannot shut our ears. So the auditory domain is shared among present people. It's necessarily shared. We cannot divide it into, of course, each one of us listens in his or her own way, but we listen to the same thing. The auditory domain is shared if you don't use headphones.
I think that kind of gets to a certain extent, it can get thrown out the window with certain experiences. You know, I'm a musician, professional musician. I've been playing since I'm 6 years old, 42 years. And I grew up with people, I wouldn't include myself in this category, but I grew up with people who could hear a very intricate solo once, hear 8 or 12 bars, and be able to play it back, note for note in the same exact way that it was played on the recording. And that was the prized principle to guide us by as young musicians. And I was hearing the same music that they were, but I would have to listen to it multiple times in order to, so we were eating the same food, but the way we were eating it and chewing it was quite different. The fact that in one person that could be existent to a certain, I mean, that's not even perfect pitch. That's a type of memory and of processing that's happening on a completely different level, with a particularly different usage than other people might, have for it, right? But we're taking in the same information, and eventually, if everybody's goal was to learn that piece of music as it was played on that recording, we're all working toward that. But there are definitely people whose experience of that and whose ability to take it in and take it out, it seems to be at odds with that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is, I was talking on a much more basic level, like talking about the stimulus. So we are listening to the same auditory input, and what it triggers in the person in your own experience, pairing it with memory, with your interest, with your experience, with your instrumental skills, or whatever is the next step. Of course, I mean, makes a huge difference in the way you listen to something. As I'm going to talk about this in the afternoon, the way of listening to something, exactly, that there are many different ways. Yeah. Now the third one, still to mention,
go on.
Because in the auditory domain and the olfactory, we have inbuilt emitter devices. Yeah, so we have the voice. So the auditory domain is something we perceive and produce at the same time, kind of very, very immediately as human beings. Which is not the same case with other sensory domains. And I think this, so to summarize my comment, the 3 properties of the auditory domain can explain very much why what we call music, or what I'd say sound in general, makes the sonic domain very susceptible to this collective, very immediate experience, and at the same time the utterance. You can sing along with anything because you have your voice. That's all. And we don't have this in vision, for example. Okay,
yeah,
it was a lot of.
It's a great point, and I think just very quickly, kind of linking it into some of the things that were mentioned, even Livia's talk and some others, about kind of the social healing space. In some of the work, and again, applied work with individuals in this space, using this music meditation, working with people in their relationship. One of the things for example, there's a couple with a marriage relationship. One of the things that was uncovered, and one of them is a neurologist, very interesting, their understanding of brain and sound and stuff, is that the way they use their voice as an instrument, as a conveyor of meaning, was an incredibly potent and often deleterious, negative impact on the relationship, based on lack of awareness, lack of mindfulness, understanding of how the voice as a sonic power, as a musical or sound power, emerged into the relationship, right? And it triggered many, many things. So, there's something about this awareness of ourselves as sound creators, as musicians in the vocal realm, that even when we speak, You know, we do it intuitively to create a certain outcome. Often we think of it emotionally, right? But it's one of those things that is incredibly powerful and potent.
Yes,
that on the social space of healing is ever present in a relationship, man.
Thank you, Benjamin. I also think that it's important clarification that Bernd brought us, and of course my question was not if I was not trying to ask if auditory realm is different from vision, from the vision. Of course it is, and you said very well why, but the question is because of these differences precisely that you highlighted, that music is, or sound, the auditory domain is so often associated to healing practices. So because if we are able to demonstrate this, I mean, if it is because of these properties, unique properties of the auditory domain, that the music has a strong connection to the emotional aspect of human life and the healing practices, then we have a very strong argument, like scientifically, to defend this kind of domain and to say, look, we really need ethnomusicologists or musicologists to talk about healing and to study healing because it works on some specificities of the auditory domain. So yeah, this is the let's say the next step of the debate, of the question: are these unique properties? Do these properties explain why sound is so often associated to healing? And if yes, maybe yes, the invisible, of course, it's but how can we demonstrate that in a very consistent way so that we?
I think that's such a beautiful and important point. And this is where ethnographic research becomes very powerful, because it allows for evidence. You know, it allows to have data that, you know, just like the ear takes a spectrum of harmonics into one sound, or the eye takes a spectrum of colors into one vision, you know, the ethnographic data, the story of a person's experience, brings all that together in a way. So I would encourage people to, you know, as we reframe our understanding of what music and sound in the auditory domain and how that experience plays out in us, that it's not necessarily about doing brain scans to prove that, to have evidence to show thus and such, to get funding, to do more research, to do whatever. It's the story of the human's experience of transformation itself can be evidence, you know, and it itself is very powerful. Do you feel what I'm saying, Filippo?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. It's a lot to think about.